sovereignty of countries is compromised and whether national security is threatened through cyber warfare, we don't see any reason not to consider it an act of war. But before I move on to my substantive, what does cyber warfare mean? It refers to things like another country hacking your national data, like Russia did with the US election, or how China does with the US through different companies, for example. I'll be proving to you two things in my speech. Firstly, I'll be proving to you principally why cyber warfare does equate to an act of war. Secondly, I'll be giving you 5 or 6 practical ways of how we comparatively make it better and safeguard different countries. So first, on the principle, let's understand your sovereignty and to put your citizens at risk. Understand that the very objective of going to war is to cause some sort of harm and to destabilize the country. So even if that doesn't come in the form of killing your people, even if it comes in the form of harming your people significantly, we think it is an act of war. So what is the idea in this argument? The idea is that warfare has evolved. So from fields and weapons and swords, we think humanity has moved on to the intel now, right? Because different countries are committing the same actions through different mechanisms such as cyber warfare, and we don't think that should be ignored. What sort of actions are we talking about? We're talking about a couple. Number one, so in the case where your national security is actively leaked, we think this opens your country up to attacks, and this is important because, like we told you, the objective of the country that attacks you is to manipulate that information to hurt your citizens. But secondly, in a lot of circumstances, they found out secret information such as war tactics, such as where your soldiers are placed. We think then your country is wasting taxpayer money by constantly having to, for example, relocate their soldiers. But thirdly, when it comes to specifically Russia and the US election, we saw its specific harms on democracy when literally without people's consent, a leader was going to literally make policies for them for the next 4 years. We don't think people should be put in that position, number one. Number two, we think what happened with the United States and Russia also left the United States susceptible to the fact that Russia, a country with numerous human rights violations, had a large amount of leverage on it simply because they had information of the United States. And thirdly, it was also representative of the fact that there were people working within the United States government who were actively leaking state secrets to Russia, which were also going to harm the people. But moving on to the second argument, which is more important, how does claiming that cyber crime is a war really make a change? I'll give you a couple of impacts. Number one, we think when you consider it a war, the optics of it become a lot more extreme. So just think about it this way. If a country blatantly invaded you and killed your people and took your national secrets, we'd be pretty sure that other allies would come and help you, and you'd have different international forums that would be willing at your door to make sure that did not happen again. We don't think that the same happens in the status quo with things like cyber warfare simply because the optics of it perhaps don't look as dangerous. What is the impact of this argument? We think this impact is specific to underdeveloped countries or countries that don't have enough power to necessarily find out or fight crimes like cyber warfare, and we think that leaves them susceptible to all the harms we discussed with you, and that's why we think that on a comparative, we understand that in the status quo you do get some level of international support as well, but we think on a comparative that's much likely to increase. Sit down, Laiba. But secondly, I'll talk to you about deterrence. Let's understand that countries use the method of cyber warfare simply because it's sneaky. It's something that's hard to trace back to individuals who actually did it. It's something that doesn't have a direct harm. It doesn't have like a direct impact in terms of killing people. So it's really hard to pinpoint a direct blame. But when you consider it an official crime, and when it falls under the ambit of you literally being punished for it, we think it's a lot more likely for countries to think twice before doing it, and on a comparative, we think it becomes a factor that they look into before they actually commit it, which we don't think exists in the status quo, simply because you don't take it serious enough. Thirdly, we think general public scrutiny really increases. Again, we understand this exists in the status quo. We also understand in the status quo, people are outraged in the US over the Russian election. But we also realize that there's a divide between, for example, the Democrats and Republicans, and even within the public about how to deal with this situation. There are a lot of people who think this isn't warfare or this isn't big enough of a deal to actually hold people accountable. What happens when you consider it a war and it falls under the ambit of all the harms that actual warfare would cause? We think it makes your public a lot more angry because it makes them realize just the impact that this cyber warfare has had on them. It makes them realize just the impact it has on their national security. Think of this way. Which one would you rather believe? The fact that Russia meddled in your election, or the fact that Russia is at war with you? We think it's a lot more likely that people become angry about this, people become aware about this, and the impact of this is, we think the general public becomes more involved and starts holding the representatives more accountable on a comparative, and we think this is important because we don't want national secrets to be leaked. Before I move on to 3 other impacts,
if you're specifically talking about developing countries that don't have enough money to, develop their cyber technology or whatever, then how will they have enough money to go and fight an actual war against the countries that are attacking them in the first place?
2 responses. Never knew that the United States was a developing country. Stop misconstruing our entire case. But second idea, when it comes to developing countries, notice the comparative. Them having no help, no international aid, because countries literally don't realize the impacts of cyber warfare, versus them getting more international aid, versus them getting more allies and help, because now other countries realize that they're actively being invaded, that their national citizens are at risk. We think in your world, which is the status quo, literally nothing is happening. But third idea, which is more so a shield, we think that you already have NSAs and states that already have checks and balances to see and trace back where the cyber attack happened from. And we think no country would blatantly go and blame another country if they weren't sure. We don't think diplomacy works like that. But fourth idea, notice, when you claim that an act is a war, it directly becomes subject to the rules of war, of international war, and of the different international courts that exist. What does this mean? This means that now cyber warfare, for example, is subject to those rules and regulations. The impact of this is important. So we're not saying that cyber warfare will stop altogether. We're saying even if it does continue, the extent of harm it can cause will be regulated, because there are now literally international bodies that are dedicated to making sure that the rules of war are upheld. And we think on a comparative, even if countries still continue this warfare, it becomes a lot more regulated and its risks also decrease. Why do we win? We win because we prove to you on a comparative that cyber warfare is already being used in the status quo as a mechanism of war. That's why it's important to deal with it in the best possible way. And because you got more deterrence, scrutiny, international support, we think give this debate to OG.
Now I would like to call the leader opposition.
Information panel. Panel, we feel like opening government really misunderstands what the nature and the kind of war that happens currently is like. We think that warfare cannot be classified as any crime. We feel like they misconstrue the entire case of side opposition when they say that cyber warfare is already not considered to be a crime. It is. There is punitive action for it at present. However, considering it an act of war has several consequences. That's a debate. Please focus on what it is. We're going to tell you 3 reasons why or what war constitutes of before I get on to negative rebuttal. Number 1. In war, there needs to be an active or at least a certain degree of loss of life that is necessitated by the action. That is the consistent case with any act of war. We would request that opening government prove to us one act of war that does not cause a loss of life directly or indirectly. We feel like that is an important metric to be decided. That is one of our metrics that, or at least comparatively, makes war a much bigger threat to be considered. Number 2, there is no way for you to conclusively ever tell where a cyber attack is coming from, and therefore it is actually very important for you to know the combatant that you are questioning, or know the combatant that you are up against. No, thank you. When you are considering or taking this act of war. I'm going to further explain why this is relevant, particularly in the case of cyber warfare, in my positive case. But for now, that is no thank you. Please don't badger. That is just a criticism of what their idea of warfare is. But thirdly, there's a really strong symbolic value that is associated with war. And I'm going to explain this later. Let's get to negative rebuttals first. No, thank you. First, they talked about, there were a few ideas that I'm going to drop completely because they weren't analyzed at all. I'm going to do a few thematic rebuttals, however, about their principle and about deterrence and about some strange bit of developing countries. No, thank you. So, their principle was how war is an active effort to go to harm people significantly. We understand that warfare does harm people. However, you don't go into war or engage into war with countries or asymmetric groups because they have just harmed your people significantly. You go into war with these groups because there is always the threat of loss of life. That is what distinguishes war from any other severe or petty crime in, let's say, domestic legislation. Therefore, even if an alien is to, let's say, an alien country or an alien individual is to, let's say, no, thank you, commit a crime that actively harms an individual in your country, or if a group is to do that, that does not necessarily mean that that is an act of war. That is considered to be a crime. That is different. But secondly, we do agree with their idea of how warfare has evolved. However, their understanding of the evolution of warfare is very wrong. And I'm going to explain this to you in a few ways. Firstly, the countries that they're talking about that potentially could have been attacked, no thank you, at developing countries in which they then characterized to being potential victims of cyber attacks and therefore a lot of people dying, we disagree with this for two reasons. Number one, often, and as opening government characterized, these aren't the countries that are targeted because these aren't the countries that are potential threats with state secrets, for example, that make a difference with the polarization of warfare in itself. It's not the United States of America or the Russian Federation. You're not likely to target these countries at all because they don't have, no thank you, the capabilities or the secrets that you want. But secondly, war on a comparative, world, in the developing world, it is necessarily going to cause much more harm to the people of that developing world because now they have to do two things. Either A, they will have to give up people for that cause and therefore put people in a potential loss of life or threat to their life. Or secondly, no thank you, or secondly, what they'll have to do is pool in a lot of resources for that cause. And that is not something that developing countries can afford to do because they're not structurally fit the same way that developed countries are. We don't buy that developing countries are a likely target. No thank you. So deterrence. We understand that it is, or at least to be able to take any action against it, or to go against it in any form, it needs to be called a crime. However, in status quo, it is already considered to be a crime. We feel like warfare carries significant negative harms with it. It is not enough for it to, why is it not? They have to explain to us why it's not enough for it to just be considered to be a crime for them to, for this action to be taken. It is not exclusive at all. No, thank you. And why is it not subject to the rules of war? I'll get to my positive. Before that, opening, go ahead.
Your principle is that war isn't war until there's loss of life. In the future, it's likely that a lot of countries start using autonomous weapons in which there are literally robots fighting against each other. Would you not consider that war?
I feel like that's a ridiculous POI. We're not arguing that. We're arguing how warfare is conducted in the present age. But even in that case, we don't feel like, you need to recognize that because of the way warfare is conducted now, countries should be able or should not be able to consider it to be called warfare now. We need to recognize that cyber capabilities and in the future cyber capabilities might evolve into a way where warfare is then considered to be a bad thing. Right now, it doesn't make a difference to us. Why is this not equal to other acts of war? This is our primary positive. I've already explained to you that number one, there is no active loss of life. Number two, there is no way for you to tell where it's coming from. And number three, why there's symbolic value, right? But what incentives would a state have then otherwise to go to war? And why would then going to war in a cyber warfare state be bad? Number one, personal agendas that countries have, because we've necessarily proven that you need to be a developed country, or are of the developed country is much more likely to be, let's say, a proponent as well as a target of cyber attacks. Number one, personal agendas of these countries can be furthered. This has historically happened. Back in 2002, when no thank you, post 9/11, the United States of America had retaliated against drone strikes against Afghanistan because of a cyber warfare attack that the Russian Federation had. It was later discovered that the Russian Federation had done so because Afghanistan necessarily doesn't have cyber warfare capabilities. We feel like the United States of America then or at least scapegoating Afghanistan and its personal agendas. For example, whatever it wants to do to seek oil or to get or for personal gain. No, thank you. In that country, for it to be able to, let's say, further its own goal, further its own particular, further its own agenda in that reason. But number two, it's also the symbolic value that it then creates is that it shows that the state is doing something which necessarily the state is not doing. We disagree with the idea that Zainab talked about. Anger is not a necessarily good driving factor of the public. We feel like anger is only going to lead to panic, number one, or undue frustration. And this against, let's say, a particular group or a particular sect. We don't feel like this undue frustration against a particular group is going to do anything but cause hatred for that group. It is going to make you less likely and less likely to accept any other narrative about that group besides the one that your government has said, because you're now panicking because you realize the immediacy of being in a war requires you to think completely differently. Why is it bad? There are four big impacts of this. I'm going to emphasize on the first two very much so. Number one, there's honestly going to be no end to cyber warfare, because cyber espionage, what it then ends up being is that one country is cyber attacking another country does that with the first. There's no end to this, and therefore it can be qualified as, let's say, a cyber attack. It's essentially because it's so hard to find, it also becomes a wild goose chase. But secondly, because asymmetric warfare is often done by small entities and is often done by small groups, like let's say terrorist groups, the nature of cyber warfare against the United States of America or other big lobby powers are also going to be done with these, let's say, small entities or small groups. It is only then necessarily the warfare that then comes out of this is necessarily going to cause significant loss of life, not only for the people that are going to conduct the warfare, because you'll have to send troops, you'll probably do drone strikes, and you'll probably, let's say, try to develop your cyber security program as well. But also, it's going to cause a lot of loss of life for the terrorist organization as well as the people in that country who are opening up.
Now I would like to call the Deputy Prime Minister from opening government to give his of his speech.
Fundamental flaw within the first speaker's speech for the opposition is that all the harms that they've pointed out of war, be it panic, they're not exclusive to this debate. Those are all generic, normal arguments of anything about a motion about war. We don't know what's the link to cyber sabotage particularly. We think the fundamental burden within any side in this debate is to link war, in this case, to cyber sabotage. Whatever the harms that they point out in opening opposition are not exclusive to cyber sabotage. They happen in any war, in any instance. There is nothing so special about whatever first opposition speaker say. But before I move on to the arguments that I have, I'm going to make a few rebuttals. Firstly, they told you that war necessarily is that this is already a crime. Cyber sabotage is already a crime. We don't really think that's true, because in a particular country, domestically they may have a law against it, but that doesn't mean that state to state to have a law. If that were true, then China would have stopped carrying out cyber sabotage against you since 2012. They've been doing it to the US since God knows how long, but they haven't stopped yet. There are no repercussions for it in the status quo. So yes, it may be a crime in a state in their own constitution, but to state, we don't really think under international law there is any such law that exists. Secondly, they talked about the idea that there only needs to be a loss of life for war to take place. That's also not true. firstly, we think that war can take place in any instance when your people have been harmed really significantly. And I'm very sorry to say, when the public opinion is swayed, when the Russians sway the public opinion to elect a man of another country, that is a significant harm to the people, because you're literally molding the mindsets to what they think. You're literally giving them knowledge based on their future. We think that is in essence a significant enough of a harm. We really don't think loss of life equates to war happening. But secondly, we also think that in the future, and this is where our POI becomes very relevant, because in the future the likelihood of you having, instead of human soldiers, are human robots. They would fight wars for you, because the impact of the POI is to tell you that loss of life doesn't matter. Any harm to your sovereignty or any direct harm to your people, if it's significant enough, does come under the ambit of, because we realize that perhaps it is quite difficult to trace it, but realize this, their example of 2002, that's 2002, this is 2019. We have much better technology than we had than we had decades ago. We also think that an example to counter that is the Russian election hacking. We think it took the US few months to actually find out that the Russians had actually hacked their DNC server. But any server, when you do hack a particular entity, so really you can trace it. It may take time, but it's not impossible to trace it. Take your seats. But then we also have this entire idea about the idea that, you know what, wars will continue to happen and whatnot. We disagree. We all don't think that wars can continue for longer periods of time. Some wars are short. We do think that wars ultimately do end at one point. Why is that so? A perfect example of this would be the trade war between the Chinese and the US. Now, the both countries literally said that we're going to cripple the economies of both countries, but they stopped at one point because they realized that this can't go on for much longer if we're causing a significant harm to both countries. But also, even if we take them at their best, that it may continue for a long time, it's still better off in our model, because now, because it's under the ambit of war, it is regulated under international law like any other war, because you can't cross certain limitations and certain boundaries in any other normal war. So the harm is much lesser in our model than it is in there, because in their model, countries would continue to carry out war without any degree of regulation. At least in the most bare minimum, you have some degree of regulation in our model. Take your seat. But also, this idea of personal agendas, again, this is generic. States will continue to carry out war or based on personal agendas or interventions on personal agendas. There is nothing so exclusive about it, the cyber sabotage. But also realize this, the likelihood of states also carrying this out in the future is much lesser, because now it's a deterrent. Realize this, war is one of the most extreme things any country can do to another country. The likelihood of them actually pursuing personal agendas in that extreme way is really less likely. They're arguing their case on an extreme in that point of view as well. And the last idea of developing countries. Over here, we need to realize that in developing countries, perhaps they don't have enough resources. But we do think that in any instance when a developing country is attacked, you have enough allies to actually help you. You have allies to provide to you, in fact, give you technology. Because they realize, because they have the incentive of a good image in the world, but more importantly, it's also a form of aid that you can give to developing countries. So the likelihood of developing countries also going to war is there, but we also do think that their likelihood of getting technology from other countries, be it developed countries, is present in that instance. So really what you had from the opposition was a generic case about war, nothing really specific to the motion or specific to cyber sabotage. Take your seat, sir. But what is my argument? I want to talk about the idea that how when you declare cyber sabotage as war really raises more awareness. I'll give you 3 impacts of it. Because realize this, in the status quo,